The notice had been sitting in her coat pocket for 11 days before she wrote back. She had read it twice on the afternoon it arrived. Once standing in the boarding house hallway with her coat still on, and once that evening by the window when the light was better, and both times she had folded it along its creases and put it away without deciding anything. It was not the kind of letter that invited quick answers. Widow preferred. Experienced with practical work. Saskatchewan territory. Respond to general delivery. Done it. Her husband had been gone 14 months. The logging accident that took him had happened on a Tuesday in early March. A morning like any other morning, the sky still pale, the snow still on the ground. And then it was not like any other morning at all. The farm outside Barrie had gone next, the way things go when the debt outlives the man. She had paid what she could from what the equipment brought at auction, and signed over what she couldn't, and walked out of the county clerk's office on a warm afternoon in June, with her trunk, her sewing basket, and the particular quiet of someone who has come to the end of a road and found no continuation. A woman at the boarding house had shown her the notice. Some of them are decent men, the woman said. The prairie land is real, at least. She wrote back on the 12th day, 3 sentences. She posted it on her way to the milliner's where she was taking in alterations for 4 cents apiece, and she did not let herself think about it further until the reply came 10 days later. 2 lines. The 8th of October will work. I will be at the Dunnet station. The handwriting was plain and even, no loops, no flourish. She thought that was worth noting. The train ran west out of Toronto on a Thursday morning, and the land opened slowly around her. The farms of southern Ontario giving way to the Shield giving way to the flatness of the prairies in a way that took longer than she had expected and arrived more suddenly than she was ready for. She watched it come through the window with her hands in her lap. She had not known the sky could be that wide and remain a single sky. She arrived at Dunnet on a Saturday, late afternoon, the light going flat and gray, the wind from the northwest carrying something that was not quite the smell of snow, but was close enough to mean something. The station was a wooden building with a hand-lettered sign above the door that had weathered to the point where only the middle letters held. She stepped onto the platform with her trunk beside her and looked at the street beyond. He was not there. She waited the length of time it took for the train to pull out and the sound of it to disappear into the distance. Then she waited longer. A man in a canvas coat crossed the far end of the street without looking her way. A dog moved between 2 buildings. The wind came down flat and steady, and the street had the particular emptiness of a place where everyone had already done what they came to do and gone home. She sat on the platform bench and took a half-finished cuff from her sewing basket and worked on it slowly, not because it required care at that point, but because her hands needed occupation. She had learned in the past 14 months that idle hands turned the mind toward directions that were not useful. At the half hour, she went into the station office and asked the agent inside where she might find the homestead belonging to the man whose name was in the notice. The agent looked up at her with an expression that rearranged itself slightly, the small recalibration of someone who has found a situation more complicated than it first appeared. He told her the quarter section was 6 miles north on the grid road. He told her the man had been in last week for wire and had looked, in the agent's words, like a man who had not been sleeping well for some time. She thanked him and asked about a livery. The livery was 2 buildings down. She paid the boy who hitched the horse from the envelope in the bottom of her basket. He looked at her trunk without being asked and took one end. She took the other. They loaded it together without conversation. He pointed north. She went. The road was straight, and the land on both sides was flat, in a way that felt, the first time you saw it, less like emptiness and more like potential that had not yet been committed to anything. The grass was dry and brown in the ditches, and the sky above was enormous, the kind of sky that does something uncomfortable to your sense of your own size if you let it. 6 miles was long enough to think. She used the time the way she had learned to use most things since March, practically without waste. She read the land the way she would read any new situation, quickly for what it was telling her, without deciding anything before she had to. The homestead appeared at the end of a long, straight approach, a house unpainted, with a porch that had settled unevenly on the west side. Behind it, a barn built with more ambition than it had received in upkeep, the boards weathered gray, the loft door hanging open. A chicken coop with a gap between the roofline and the east wall, wide enough to see daylight through. A garden plot turned once in the summer and then abandoned, the soil cracked and pale at the surface. She kept the horse at the same pace and looked at all of it. A man came out of the barn as she pulled into the yard. He was lean, moving with the unhurried economy of someone long accustomed to working alone, wiping his hands on a cloth that had been gray for some time. He stopped at the barn door and watched her bring the horse to a halt. He did not come forward. She looped the reins over the post herself and stood in the yard. He crossed toward her. His face had the quality of a thing that had been open once and had since taken on the character of the weather it had been left in. Not unkind, but weathered all the way through. He looked at her trunk in the back of the wagon. She said she was the woman from Barry, the one who had answered the notice. He said he figured. He had been off by a day on the date, he said. He had expected her Sunday. She said the trains ran on a schedule she did not set. He considered this as though it were genuinely new information. He folded the cloth through his belt loop and looked at the barn, and then at her, and then at the coop with its leaning east wall. He said the house was small. She said she had seen small houses. He said the water was clean. He said it in the particular way a man offers the one certain thing about a piece of property he is not sure how to present honestly, plain, without decoration, because honesty was the only currency he had that was not currently at risk. She noted that without comment. He took one end of her trunk. She took the other. They carried it up the porch steps, the west side dipping under their combined weight, and through the front door. Inside, a table, 2 chairs, a stove against the north wall, a window on the east side with no curtain, a shelf with a tin cup and a lamp. Swept clean, she noted that. He had swept before she arrived, or he swept as a habit, and she did not yet know which. He set his end of the trunk down near the cot and stepped back. She crossed to the stove and opened the firebox. The iron around the lower vent had cracked, and someone had wedged a flattened tin can into the gap to keep the draw working. It was not elegant, but it would hold. She pressed it with her thumb, testing the fit. It held. He was watching from behind her. She asked how much wood was split. He said there was 1.5 cords along the south wall of the barn. She nodded and looked at the stovepipe, which ran clean to the ceiling, the boards around the collar unstained. Then she looked at the shelf above the wood box. A letter, already opened, folded once and set on the shelf without being put away. The letterhead visible at the fold, Dominion Bank of Canada, Moose Jaw. She did not touch it. She looked at it long enough to know it was there, and then she turned and began to unpack her trunk. In the morning, she was up before him. She had the stove going by the time she heard his boots on the porch. She had found flour and lard and salt in the cabinet and had checked the shelf above the wood box again. Not to read the letter, which she had not touched, but to note that it had not moved. It had not. He came in and stopped when he saw her at the stove. Something careful crossed his face and passed. She put a plate in front of him and sat across with her own. They ate without speaking. Through the east window, the morning came in low and flat. The frost had not lifted from the field yet, and it caught the early light so that the grass looked, briefly from this distance, as though it might amount to something. She said the field had been worked before. He said 2 years back it hadn't held. She asked what he had put in. He told her. She listened without looking up from her plate. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said the soil looked stripped, the kind of pale that came when ground had given what it had without getting anything back. He said he didn't have money to address that. She said there might be ways that didn't cost money. Rotted matter from the barn floor worked in, wood ash from the stove. She had read about it and had seen it done. He looked at her then, not with hope, which she would have mistrusted at this stage, but with the particular attention a man gives something he has decided to take seriously before he understands why. She picked up her plate and said she would go look at the chickens. coop told her most of what she needed to know in the first 5 minutes. 3 birds thin across the chest, straw that had not been turned in weeks, a water basin with a green rim, a gap in the east wall that let the wind through as freely as the yard. She went through it methodically, letting the birds settle to her before she moved among them. She checked the feed, pressed a handful, smelled it, read the color. Not spoiled, but not good either. She checked the roost boards. 2 of them were cracked through. He stood at the coop door and did not come in. When she came out, she told him the east wall gap needed filling before the temperature dropped further. She said the straw needed turning today. She said she thought 2 of the birds were competing for the same roost position, and she would know more after watching them for a day. He said he could do the straw this morning. She said she could show him how to mix crushed shell into the feed. She had seen it help before. He would need to save the eggshells from now on. He said he hadn't known that. She said most people didn't. They walked back past the garden plot. She stopped at the edge and looked at the cracked soil. He stopped a step behind her. She asked if anyone had worked it last season. He said no. He said the year before his wife had. He said it the way a person says, a thing they have said often enough that it moves through them cleanly now, without snagging. She heard it and looked at the garden for a moment longer, and then walked on. Friday, she went into town with him. 6 miles on the grid road, the sky low and white at the horizon, the wind from the northwest. They did not talk much. She watched the land and thought about the east wall of the coop and the drainage at the low point of the field she had noticed from the road coming in. The way the soil there was darker than it should have been, the grass shorter, the kind of low ground that drowned roots before they set. The general store in Dunnet was run by a woman named Mrs. Dunfield, who had a precise and watchful quality that suggested she had been forming opinions about people for a long time and had arrived at most of them. She looked at the list without picking it up, and then she looked at her. "Whose account?" she said. She gave his name and the Homestead number. Mrs. Dunfield said the account was carrying a balance from August. She set the list flat on the counter between them. She looked at the items. She took the pencil Mrs. Dunfield offered and crossed off the lamp wicking and the extra bolt of calico and the second sack of oats. She pushed the list back. Mrs. Dunfield looked at what remained and said she could do that much. Then, while she was wrapping the cornmeal, her hands moving with the economy of someone who had been wrapping things all day for 20 years, she said she had heard from Hartwell at the land office that there was a bank matter outstanding on the property. She said it quietly and without drama, the way one woman passes information to another across a counter when there is something useful in the knowing of it. She did not ask what kind of matter. She knew what kind. She carried the box out to the wagon and stood for a moment in the cold with her hand on the board. The bank letter on the shelf above the wood box. She had not read it, and she did not need to. She understood now the shape of what it contained, and she understood that he had not told her, and she understood that he might not tell her until he felt he had no other choice. She got back up on the seat. He came out of the hardware with a small paper of nails and set it in the box without comment. They drove north. The cold settled in the second week of November and stayed. She could feel it in the walls by morning, coming in not through the door, but through the wood itself, the joints and the chinking and the places where the mortar had shrunk away. She mixed new chinking from ash and sawdust and clay. She found at the base of the creek bank south of the fence line, and she filled the gaps methodically, one wall at a time. The coop she worked on in the afternoons. The east wall patched with boards she found stacked behind the barn, the roost replaced, the water basin scrubbed and kept full. 11 of the 14 birds were laying regularly by the end of the 3rd week. She noted it without announcing it. He was working the north fence line. She could hear him in the afternoons, the sound of post-work, methodical and patient, and in the evenings he would say what he had finished, and she would say that was good, and that would be most of it. The blizzard came on a Saturday at the end of November. She had seen the sky the evening before, and had brought in enough wood for 2 days without being told. By 9 in the morning there was nowhere to be and no point in trying. She was at the table with the mending basket. He sat near the stove with a piece of harness he was restitching. The room held those sounds for several hours, needle through cloth, all through leather, the storm pressing against the north wall in long sustained pushes. In the afternoon, he set the harness down. He said the banknote was due in March. She kept her needle moving through the hem she was turning. He said he had not wanted to say it before now. He said there was a balance on the property from when his father had taken the loan, and 2 difficult seasons had not reduced it the way he had expected, and the account at Dunnet was thin, and if he was being honest, he was not certain what spring looked like. She set the mending in her lap. She said she had wondered about that. He looked at her. She said she had not wanted to ask before he was ready to say it. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the stove. He said he should have said it sooner. She said there was still time between now and March. He said not much. She said enough. She said the field could still go into winter wheat. It needed to go in before the ground froze hard, but there were days yet where the top layer was workable. She said the soil needed turning with the barn compost, and she had been thinking about the drainage at the low point in the east quarter, that there was a spot there where water pooled in spring and drowned whatever tried to root. She had met a neighbor on the road 3 weeks ago, a man named Sorensen, who had dug a simple grade cut along the low line of his field and had changed what that ground would hold. He listened to all of it without interrupting. He said he hadn't known she had met Sorensen. She said she had been walking the fence line and he had stopped his team. He said the low point in the east quarter had been sitting wrong for 3 years. He said he had looked at it and not known what he was looking for. She said that was not unusual. She said knowing what to look at and knowing what you were seeing were 2 different things, and mostly you needed someone who had seen it before. The storm moved along the eaves in long, even pulls. The lamp burned low and steady. Outside there was nothing but white and wind, and inside the fire held, and neither of them said anything further for a while. But the quality of the silence had changed. It was closer now, less space between them than there had been before, and she felt that without needing to name it. She began on the drainage cut the first week of December, on the days when the frost held only to the top inch, and the layer beneath was still workable. She took the spade from the barn before he was up and walked the low line of the east quarter in the gray early light, reading the grade, tracing the direction the meltwater would want to run. She dug in 2-hour stretches before the cold made the work diminishing, then went in and made breakfast. He figured it out on the 3rd morning. He did not say anything about it. He came out after breakfast and picked up the 2nd spade and dug. They worked the line together without talking much, and by the end of the first week, they had opened 40 yards of cut along the grade, the channel running clean to the low corner of the fence. In January, the Chinook came. 4 days of impossible warmth, the snow pulling back from the south-facing slopes, the ground giving 2 feet down, and she used it. She worked the compost into the south half of the east quarter until her arms ached, and then she worked it some more, and on the 3rd day of the warm spell, she got the winter wheat seed worked in on the prepared ground. He dug alongside her in the afternoons without being asked. The Chinook passed, and the cold came back harder than before, and the seed was in the ground, and there was nothing left to do but keep the animals and keep the house and wait for what the spring would say. Hartwell came in the 2nd week of February. He arrived by cutter from Moose Jaw, a round man with a careful way of assessing things that told her he had seen properties in worse condition than expected and had learned not to register it on his face. He walked the east field first. He walked the full length of the drainage cut, looking at the grade, looking at the direction it ran. He stopped at the low corner and crouched down and pressed the soil with his palm the way a person does when they are checking something they already partly know the answer to. He walked to the coop and stood outside it for a moment and counted the birds through the wire. He came back to the yard and spoke with him near the barn for 15 minutes. She watched from the kitchen window without appearing to watch. Hartwell left before noon. That evening he came in and washed at the basin and sat at the table, and she set his plate. in front of him. He did not pick up his fork right away. He said Hartwell had extended the note to July. She said that was good. He said it was more than good. He said Hartwell had asked about the drainage cut and about the winter seeding and had said the East Quarter showed more evidence of preparation than most homesteads he visited that were 3 years further along. He had asked who laid out the grade line. He paused. He said he had told Hartwell it was her plan. She looked at her plate. He said it was the truth, and it seemed like the right thing to say. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said she had not done it alone. She said she had known what needed doing, and he had come out with the second spade on the third morning without a word, and had worked the line beside her in frozen ground until the light ran out, and that was not a small thing, and she thought Hartwell should know that too. He looked at her with something she had not seen on his face before. Closer to recognition than surprise. The way a man looks when he realizes someone has been watching carefully and has seen something he thought he was keeping to himself. Spring came to the prairie the way it always did, not gently, but with decision. The frost came out of the ground in 3 days, and the field went dark with moisture, and the winter wheat came up in the second week of April. Green rose steady across the south half of the East Quarter, straight and unhurried, the way things grow when the ground has been properly prepared for them. She stood at the edge of the field one morning, with her coat unbuttoned for the first time since October, and looked at the rows. Sorensen came past in early May with his boy and leaned on the fence rail and said the East Quarter was looking like the best prepared piece of ground in the district. He said 2 other families had been asking about the drainage method. He said it as a plain fact, which was the best kind. She said the method was not hers. She had learned it from watching. He said that was how most of the good things got passed around. After he drove off, she stood at the gate for a moment. The field behind her, the yard ahead, the house at the end of it, the porch still uneven on the west side, the step she had been stepping around since October, the one she had noted in the first week and not mentioned because there were other things ahead of it. She walked up the path. When she came in, she found he had replaced the step. A clean piece of spruce, set flush and even, the edge sanded smooth. He was not in the house. She could hear him in the barn. She stood on the new board and looked out at the field and at the enormous May sky above it, blue in the particular way it is only in early spring on the prairies. And she felt something she did not try to name, because naming it would have made it smaller than it was. That evening, he came in and she put supper on the table and they sat. He poured 2 cups of coffee and pushed one to her side. He had been doing that since February without making a point of it. And she wrapped her hands around it the way she did when the evenings were still cool. He said the south fence was done. He said he thought the North Quarter could go in next year if the summer went the way it looked. She said she thought so too. The window was open and the smell of turned earth came in with the air. The light held long, the way it does in May on the prairies, the sky keeping its color past the point you expect. He turned his cup in his hands. He looked at the window, and then he looked at her. He said he had written the notice with a particular idea in mind. A practical arrangement. Someone to keep the house and tend the animals. He said he thought he had been clear about what he was asking for. She waited without filling the silence. He said what he had not accounted for was what arrived. He said he did not know, when he wrote those 2 sentences, that a person could walk onto a failing piece of ground and see it whole, not what it was at that moment, but what it was capable of becoming. He said he had not known that was a thing a person could do, or that anyone would do it quietly, without being asked, without making him feel the weight of what was being done. He stopped. He was not a man who reached for words easily, and she had learned not to move into the spaces he was still working through. She said she had not come expecting much. He said he knew that. She said that had changed. He did not look away from her. He got up from the table and crossed to where she was standing near the stove, not quickly, without anything in the movement that demanded, and stood close enough that she could feel the warmth coming off him in the cool of the kitchen. She looked up at him. She had been careful, these months, about what she let herself want. But careful has its limits, and she had reached them somewhere around January, in the frozen East Quarter, with both of them working the grade line in the gray morning light without needing to speak. She reached up and set her hand briefly against the side of his face, not as a question, but as an answer to the one he had not yet found the words for. He brought his hand up and covered hers and held it there, just that, and neither of them moved for a while. The fire settled behind her. The window stood open and the spring air moved through it in long even passes, carrying the smell of the wheat field and the turned earth and the particular cold that stays in the Saskatchewan nights until June. Outside the field was dark now, but she knew it was there. She had put it there herself, row after row in the January ground, in the brief thaw before the cold came back, and it had held. The knowing of that was different from pride. It was closer to the feeling you get when you have been right about something that mattered. Not triumphant, only steadied by it. The kind of certainty that does not need announcing. In the morning, she was at the window before he came in from the barn, her coffee cooling in her hands. The wheat was up 4 inches, and the rows were straight, and the drainage cut ran clean along the low grade of the East Quarter, exactly as she had traced it on the frost of the kitchen window pane in December, her finger moving against the glass while the wind pressed on the north wall, and he had stood beside her, close, watching. She had not known then whether it would hold. The barn door opened, and he crossed the yard in the early light, his breath visible in the cool air, and he came up the porch steps, the new board steady and even under him, and opened the door and came in. He found her at the window. He stopped in the doorway. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he has stopped being afraid of losing, which is a different thing entirely from the way he looks at something he is simply certain of, and is the better of the two by a good distance. She turned from the window and began to make breakfast. The field held. The wheat grew straight and even through May and into June, and the two of them went on together in the good quiet manner of people who have learned, through a long winter's worth of small things done and kept, to trust the ground beneath them.